Hello, good day to everyone. Welcome to our another session here in Experimental Psychology Laboratory. For today, napakahalaga ng pag-uusapan natin ngayon. We are going to discuss experiments in comparison to other research methods that we use in the field of psychology. But before that, bigyan ko lang kayo ng isang mabilisang seat work. I would like you to write down 3 psychological questions na sa tingin nyo kayang masagot ng experiment. It can be anything under the sun. As long as sa tingin mo kayang masagot yung tanong na ito ng isang experiment in psychology, you write down those questions. 3. Okay, so I would like you to pause the video right now and do this seat work. There was a survey done by the APA, the American Psychological Association. Tinanong nila yung kanilang mga members, and these are thousands of psychologists. Ano ang research method daw na pinakagusto nilang gamitin bilang mga professional psychologist? Remember, in psychology, marami tayong mga methods of research, di ba? Nandiyan ang observation, we can do survey, case study, interview, correlation, and of course, our subject, experiment. So these are the different research methods na pwede nating gamitin in answering psychological questions in our field. And going back to that survey na binigay ng APA, according to their survey results, most psychologists would prefer to use experiments in answering their psychological questions. Now, the question now is, bakit kaya experiment yung pine-prefer ng mga psychologists over the other methods? There must be something special about experiments na gusto nila ito over the other research methods, no? So yan yung pag-uusapan natin today. What is so special in experiments that most psychologists would prefer this method over the other methods? But let me just give you a clue or teaser kung bakit kaya nila pine-prefer yung experiment. Because experiments are considered more powerful method compared to the other methods. But please don't get me wrong, hindi natin sinasabi na hindi powerful yung ibang methods, no? They are also powerful. It's just that there is something special about experiments na meron siyang kayang gawin na hindi kayang gawin ng iba pang mga methods. So the question is, what's that? What is this something that experiments can do that other methods cannot do? Yan yung pag-uusapan natin for today. We are going to compare experiments to the other research methods being done in the field of psychology. But let me give you another task to do. In the following slides, I am going to give you problems. I would like you to read it. I-pause nyo na lang kung kailangan yung i-pause. Pero yung task nyo in this exercise is, I would like you to choose among the research methods here, which research method do you think is the best that we can use to answer the following problems? Okay, so bawat isang problema, pili ka lang ng isang research method. Again, you just pause the video if you need to. Okay, let's start. Ready? Problem number 1. Which research method do you think is the most appropriate to be used? Problem number 2. Again, you can just pause the video if you need to. Problem number 3. Problem number 4. Problem number 5. Okay, so let's now talk about the correct answers. I-reveal ko na what are the most appropriate research methods that we can use given those problems. Let's start with number 1. For problem number 1, again, you just pause the video if you need to. Ang pinakabagay na research method na gamitin dito is none other than observation. So let's talk about psychological observation. Ano ba to? The observation method is a research method in psychology where we passively describe patterns of behavior. So maraming beses na tayong gumagamit ng observation method, especially in the field of psychology. And when do you use observation? Kapag meron kang gustong i-describe na behavior at gusto mo siyang gusto mo siyang i-emphasize, gusto mo siyang i-explore, no? Most likely, you are going to use observation. Let me give you one example of a research topic na kayang gamitan ng observation. Ito na nga yung problem natin kanina, no? If you would like, for example, to study what are the different flirting styles women use in a bar, ang gagawin mo lang dyan is punta ka talaga sa mga bars, and then passively, ibig sabihin ng passive is you are not going to influence what's happening in the bar. Hanap ka ng upuan from afar, you observe how women flirt in the bar. So all you need to do is to go to a bar and then find a place, ilabas mo yung notebook mo, and then obserbahan mo yung mga ginagawa ng girls in flirting with other people, and then you take down notes kung ano yung mga nakikita mo. So that's what you mean by passively observing people from afar to study their behavior. Another good example of a research study na ginamitan ng observation method was the study by Jane Goodall na napanood nyo in your pre-lecture video, di ba? In that study, very clearly, ang pinaka-method talaga na ginagamit ni Jane was observation to better understand the behaviors of monkeys. Liwanag ba? Alright. Let's move on to problem number 2. I think the most appropriate method that we can use for problem number 2 is none other than the case study method. Ano naman ibig sabihin ng case study? This is a detailed description of a psychological phenomenon over time. Kumbaga parang ano lang to, no? Parang pinahabang observation lang. Observation is more shorter in duration. Diba? Yung observation kasi, for example, you want to study how women flirt in a bar, you can just finish that in one night. Diba? Punta ka lang sa isang bar for one night, mag-observe ka lang doon, and then the next day, you begin to write your paper. But in the case study method, again, as you can see on the slide, it is more detailed. And at the same time, it has longer duration compared to observation. Diba? Kaya, whenever you see a study na ginamitan ng case study method, you would expect that this is going to be a very long study. And usually, case study is being used to study unusual, mga kakaiba, mga hindi pangkaraniwan na mga psychological topics. Like for example, if you have seen the movie The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, although this is fictional, pero ano yung kakaiba kay Benjamin Button? Yung kanyang developmental pattern kakaiba, baliktad, no? Nagsimula siya ng bata o nagsimula siya ng matanda, habang tumatanda siya, nagiging bata siya. So kung maging totoo man yung ganyang condition, I'm sure there will be a lot of case studies that will be done to study that particular condition. So going back to problem number 2, yung problema dito ng cycling, ang pinakamagandang gawin dito para pag-aralan yung problem is basically you live with the subject. And that's what you do in a case study, di ba? You live with the subject and then you take down notes about basically everything that you see from the subject. Kaya kinakailangan talaga makikitira ka sa kanya, no? Titignan mo lahat ng ginagawa niya, anong kinakain niya, anong ginagawa niya araw-araw, ano ba yung mga habits niya. That's what we do in case study method. Some trivia about the case study method. Alam nyo ba, the case study method is very powerful that it can be used to create psychological theories. And do you know that in psychology, marami na tayong mga theories na ang pinaka-origin niya, the reason why those theories existed was because we use case study. One example would be the theory created by John Piaget, di ba? Si John Piaget is a psychologist very popular in developmental psychology. Siya yung nagsabi o siya yung gumawa ng theory that our cognitive development is consists of the following stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, and then you move on to concrete operational, and then later on formal operational. Question: paano nalaman ni John Piaget that our cognitive development undergoes the following stages? He used case study of his own children. So, merong mga anak si John Piaget, talagang inobserbahan niya yung paglaki, inobserbahan niya yung mga cognitive abilities ng kanyang mga anak, one by one, and then from there, he was able to create, he was able to formulate the theory of cognitive development. Ganyan ka-powerful ang case study. in the field of psychology, it has the ability to come up with a psychological theory. Another good example of a theory born out of case study was the theory created by Sigmund Freud, diba? Yung kanyang psychodynamic theory. If you remember, yung psychodynamic theory, dito sumikat yung mga terms na id, ego, superego, the conscious, subconscious, the unconscious, the defense mechanisms, Oedipus complex. Question, paano ba nalaman lahat ito ni Freud? Again, by collecting all the cases that he handled when he was still a practicing doctor. Remember, Sigmund Freud was a doctor, no? So kinolekta niya yung mga cases, yung mga kakaibang mga cases ng kanyang mga patients, and then he combined all those cases to come up with the psychodynamic theory. And one of the more popular cases na talagang inspired Sigmund Freud to come up with this theory was the case of Anna O. Diba? If you're not familiar with Anna O, basahin nyo na lang on your own. But this is one of the cases that really made Freud believe that there is such a thing as the unconscious. Let's now move on to problem number 3. Itong problema ni Dr. Kepner. I think the most appropriate research method to be used here is none other than the correlational method. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng correlational method? It is a statistical technique. Diba? Kaya nga sabi ko, hindi totoo na walang math sa psychology. Meron tayong math. Okay? And one of the mathematics that we use in psychology is to use correlation. Kailan ba natin ginagamit yung correlation in psychology? Basically, we use correlation if we want to measure how strong the relationship is between two psychological variables. So again, as you can see on the slide, di ba kapag nakakita ka ng isang correlational study, you are going to see a lot of numbers. Ang tawag dun sa numbers na yon, if you still remember your statistics, ang tawag dyan is the Pearson's R or the Pearson's correlation. So you are using Pearson's R to determine kung gaano ba ka-close o kung gaano ba kalakas yung relationship between psychological variable A and psychological variable B. Let me give you a very quick example. Halimbawa, you would like to know kung gaano kalakas yung relationship between religiosity and self-confidence. Okay? So you would like to know how strong the relationship is between religiosity and self-confidence. What do we do in correlation? Gagawa tayo ng questionnaires o ng mga psychological tests that will measure religiosity and that will measure self-confidence. And then we give those tests to people to answer, and then from there we are going to measure each person's religiosity and self-confidence. After we measure their religiosity and their self-confidence, i-correlate na natin. So, tuturuan kayo ng teacher nyo sa statistics kung paano ba ginagawa yan. No? But to make the long story short, at the end of the day, if you run a correlation analysis, you are going to get a correlation coefficient. Diba? Yun na yung mga numbers na nakikita ninyo whenever you see studies in correlation. So basically, the correlation coefficient will tell you how strong the relationship is between religiosity and self-confidence. So your teacher in statistics will teach you how to read and how to interpret the correlation coefficient. But very quickly, daanan ko na lang din yan. So in a correlation coefficient, you can see two parts. Meron kang direction, which is the plus or the minus, yung nakalagay dyan, and the magnitude or the strength, yun yung decimal number. Okay? So in this case, there seems to be kapag positive, it means the relationship is direct, diba? There is a direct relationship between religiosity and self-confidence. And how strong is the relationship? It's very strong because the coefficient is 0.93. Remember, as that number approaches 1, the stronger the relationship. As that number approaches 0, the weaker the relationship. So in this case, there is a direct and strong relationship between religiosity and self-confidence. Anong ibig sabihin nun? It seems like those people who are highly religious are more likely to be very self-confident. And those people who are very self-confident, most likely, you can expect that they are also religious. And vice versa, ganun din naman. Kapag bumababa naman yung religiosity, bumababa rin yung self-confidence. Kapag bumababa yung self-confidence, bumababa rin yung religiosity. So using that principle, going back to problem number 3, ang gagawin lang natin dito is we are going to quantify the two psychological variables here, which are relational conflict and feelings of intimacy. So gagawa tayo ng mga psychological instruments to measure relational conflict and feelings of intimacy, and then ipapakalat mo yan sa mga tao para sagutan, and then from there, you are going to run a correlation analysis. Okay, so halimbawa meron tayong 50 couples who answered the relational conflict scale and the feelings of intimacy scale. After we get their scores from each of the tests, we are going to run a correlation. Now, hypothetical result. Halimbawa, ito yung naging result. Negative 0.93. What does that mean? In this case, yung ating direction, which is this time negative, it's inverse or reverse. Which means as one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. If the other variable goes down, the other variable goes up. So that means the relationship is inverse. And since this is 0.93, malapit ito sa 1, the relationship is strong. So anong ibig sabihin nito? There is an inverse strong relationship between relational conflict and feelings of intimacy, which means, anong sinasabi ng pag-aaral na ito? Yung mga couples na madalas mag-away, mas bumababa yung kanilang level of intimacy, and vice versa. Yung mga couples naman na hindi masyadong nag-aaway, low relational conflict, tumataas naman yung kanilang feelings of intimacy. Okay, so that's what we do in correlational studies. Let's now move on to problem number 4. This problem about Miggy. Ang pinaka method na bagay dito is the method of interview. Anong ginagawa natin sa interview? This is a research method where we try to have a conversation with someone where we aim to describe a certain psychological experience. So sa interview, parang nakikipag-usap ka lang sa mga participants mo, pero meron kang goal. Meron kang research question na gustong sagutin, kaya ka nakikipag-converse doon sa tao. Yan yung pinagkaiba ng kwentuhan lang compared to interview. Interview is it's very direct. You have a specific goal. You have a research question that you want to answer in doing an interview. Halimbawa, meron akong nabasang isang research, very interesting, na ginamitan ng interview. In this research, the author wanted to understand the psychology of the mistresses, yung mga kabet, di ba? Bakit ba gusto niyang malaman kung ano ba yung mga general experiences ng mga mistresses? So, ang ginawa niya sa kanyang research method, talagang nangolekta siya ng mga mistresses. Okay, so doon pa lang napaka-challenging nung nung task niya, but this author was able to find approximately 10 mistresses, and then he talked to these mistresses one by one, asking them certain questions, and then from there he was able to generate certain themes that describe the experience of being a mistress. Bigyan ko kayo ng mga halimbawa na mga data na lumabas sa kanyang analysis. According to his analysis, most mistresses experience the following things. Number 1, acceptance. Ibig sabihin yan, based sa kanyang mga interview sa mga mistresses, karamihan naman daw talaga ng mga mistresses, they accept the fact that they are mistresses. Hindi sila nagdi-deny na sila ay mga kabet at yung kanilang lover meron talagang ibang pamilya. Pero doon sa second theme, yung umaasa, most of these mistresses, even if they accept that they are mistresses, umaasa sila that one day they will be the one who will become the legitimate relationship. So umaasa pa rin sila na iiwan ng lover nila yung tunay na pamilya at sila sa kanila sasama. Most of these mistresses also experience anxiety and jealousy. So kahit na alam nila na yung lover nila may ibang pamilya, the more na nakaka-experience sila ng selos. So there are a lot of times na kapag mag-isa sila sa gabi, alam nila na yung lover nila kasama yung pamilya nila, doon nila na-feel yung anxiety at jealousy sa pagiging mistress. And number 4, meron din silang tinatawag na sense of competition. Ibig sabihin, karamihan ng mga mistresses, nagkakaroon sila ng drive, ng motivation to compete with the legal wife. Ibig sabihin, tuwing kasama nila yung lover nila, nagtotodo effort sila para ipakita doon sa kanilang lover that they are better than the legal wife, hoping na kapag nakita yon ng kanilang lover, yung lover nila baka iwan yung kanyang tunay na pamilya at sumama sa kanya. So again, sa kinuwento ko pa lang sa inyo ng mabilis, napaka-interesting na ng mga sinabi kong mga experiences ng mga mistresses. And again, how did this author found out? How did this author found out those experiences na meron ang mga mistresses? By doing interviews from the mistresses. So napaka-powerful din na method yang interview method na ito, no? So this interview, by the way, i-add ko lang, no, it can be done one-on-one, person to person, parang yung ginagawa ni Boy Abunda, di ba? One-on-one yon. Pero interviews can also be done in groups. Ito naman yung tinatawag na FGD or Focus Group Discussion. At alam nyo ba, yung FGD na yan, madalas yan ginagamit sa marketing research. Especially when, for example, a company plans to release a new product, bago nila i-release sa market yan, ipapa-experience muna nila yan to a certain group of people, and then from there, kapag na-experience na nila yung product, kakausapin sila as a group para malaman nung company if their product is good or not. Okay? Yan yung mag-guide sa decision nila if they are going to release the product or not. So again, interview, a very powerful method of research that is being used in the field of psychology. So going back to problem number 4, itong pinoproblema ni Miggy about the psychology of success, ang magandang gawin nyo dito is maghanap siya ng mga mayayamang tao tapos interviewin niya. Sa interview niya, he is going to look for certain themes that are true, na makikita niya across all the rich people that he is talking to. Ano ba yung mga common qualities nila? Ano yung mga common beliefs nila? What are their common patterns of behaviors? Diba? And then from there, maa-analyze niya kung ano ba tong mga factors na ito that make these rich people very rich. In fact, itong example ko na ito na problem ni Miggy, ginawa ko lang tong hypothetical, but this is a real life study done by Thomas Stanley, who is a researcher na gusto niyang pag-aralan yung the same topic. Basically, who would like to know kung bakit ba merong mga tao sa Amerika na sobrang mayayaman. In fact, yung in his study, yung kanyang mga kinausap dito are people considered as decamillionaires. Ibig sabihin ng decamillionaires, meron kang at least $10 million in your bank account. So grabe, sobrang yayaman ng mga taong ito. Gustong malaman ni Thomas Stanley what do they have in common that they are this successful. So to make the long story short, ang ginawa nga niya dito, kumausap siya ng mga decamillionaires and then humanap siya ng mga common themes. Ano ba yung mga common things na ginagawa ng mga tao na decamillionaires? And what was his finding? Very interesting. Ito yung mga key qualities ng mga tao na decamillionaires. Okay? Ito yung mga common na ginagawa nila. They do a lot of preparation. They have the ability to focus on key issues. They are very decisive. They love to plan. They are well organized. And they are very good in setting goals. But in his book, he summarized this way. Sabi niya, itong mga qualities na nakita niya, if you are going to relate this in psychology, ibig sabihin lang nito, matataas sila sa levels of conscientiousness. So if you remember your theories of personality, di ba? Yung Big Five theory, sinasabi doon na yung ugali ng tao, pwede mo siyang i-analyze into 5 smaller components. Yun yung ocean. And in letter C, yun yung tinatawag nating conscientiousness. Kung gaano ka ka-organize at gaano ka ka-responsable sa buhay mo. So according to Thomas Stanley, kung i-analyze mo yung data niya, ito yung lumabas. That you are more likely to be a millionaire if you have very high levels of conscientiousness. Kasi nga, yung mga nakausap niyang mga decamillionaires, lahat sila matataas yung levels of conscientiousness. Okay, so this is the magic trait to really work on that will make a person financially successful. And last one, let's move on to problem number 5. Itong pinoproblema ni Jenna, ang pinakabagay na method dito is none other than survey. So when you see a problem involving thousands of people, meron kang research question, and you would like to base the answer to that question on the responses of thousands of people, most likely magpapasurvey ka dyan. Diba? In survey, what we are doing is we are trying to describe the thinking or the attitude of many people. How many people? Marami. Hundreds, thousands. Minsan nga may mga survey studies na hundreds of thousands yung kanilang participants. No? Basta, in survey, gagamitin natin to most likely if we have many participants and we would like to find out kung ano ba yung kanilang iniisip, ano ba yung kanilang attitude towards a certain issue. So going back to the problem of Jenna, ang dapat niyang gawin talaga dito is magbabahay-bahay siya. Diba? Hahanap talaga siya ng mga participants, bahay to bahay, or pwede rin siyang pumunta sa mall or to any other public places where she can give out these questionnaires. And then from there, kapag nabigay na niya yung mga questionnaires niya, sasagot na ng mga tao, and then from there, she can now collect the results of her survey study. Kung napanood nyo yung pre-lecture video ko before this video, 'di ba? Meron kayong isang pinanood doon that talks about how survey research can be done, no? Yung ulat tungkol sa teenage pregnancy, no? So if you would like to study the different patterns of teenage pregnancy in the Philippine setting, most likely magpapa-survey method ka diyan. 'Di ba? Ano ba yung attitude ng mga magulang towards teenage pregnancy? Ano ba yung attitude ng mga teenagers themselves about teenage pregnancy? Okay lang ba na manganak sila ng bata pa? You know? Kino-consider ba nila na maganda o hindi maganda yung kanilang pagbubuntis at such a young age? So if you have those questions and you expect thousands of people to answer those questions, most likely magpapa-survey research ka talaga. Okay. So yun, no? Yun yung mga different methods na dapat yung gamitin given those different problems. So sana na perfect nyo, no? But let's continue our discussion. Going back to those 5 methods that we have been discussing, did you notice something in common? Kung babalikan nyo ulit yung mga definition ng mga methods na pinag-aralan natin, I think you will notice that one thing that they have in common is all these methods aim to describe a certain psychological phenomenon. Kaya nga natin ginagamit yung mga methods na ito because these are methods that can help us describe certain psychological phenomenon. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng describe? Based on the screen, to tell by saying or writing how something looks, smells, sounds, feels, or tastes like. Pero of course, in psychology, hindi naman lahat yan ginagamit natin. But the point here is, when you use these methods, it will enable you to describe certain psychological experiences, which is yun naman talaga yung goal ng psychology. But merong problema. Merong problema dito sa 5 research methods na sinabi natin, meron kasi silang limitation. Merong hindi kayang gawin yung mga methods na ito. You know? If you notice, yung mga methods na sinabi natin kanina, they can only describe. Right? But then, in science, when you are a scientist, alam nyo, isa sa mga bagay na talagang napaka-useful in the field of science is we need to establish causality. Ibig sabihin ng established causality, we would like to know what is the cause of a certain outcome. 'Di ba? In psychology, marami tayong mga nakikitang mga outcomes. Yung mga tao nalulungkot o yung mga tao sumasaya, yung mga tao nai-stress. These are different psychological outcomes. The thing is, in psychology, minsan we want to go beyond simply describing, 'di ba? Gusto natin mas marami tayong alam other than describing depression, other than describing happiness, other than describing stress. We would like to know what causes depression, what causes happiness, what causes stress. Tama? We would like to know what is the cause of these things. We would like to establish causal relationships among psychological variables. Yan ngayon ang problema ng 5 methods. Kasi yung 5 methods, yan yung weakness nila. They are unable hindi nila kaya mag-establish ng causality. Let me expose that weakness of the 5 methods. Halimbawa, going back here, is there a relationship between level of stress and aggression? Kayang-kayang sagutin ng correlational method yan, di ba? So, i-quantify mo lang yung stress, i-quantify mo yung aggression, and then you correlate the numbers, then we can describe the relationship between stress and aggression. But remember, correlation does not establish causality. You remember that? Correlation does not establish causality. Halimbawa, yung lumabas na result is there is a direct and strong relationship between stress and aggression. Are we saying that aggression causes stress? Or are we saying that stress causes aggression? The answer is we don't know because the study is correlational. Correlation does not establish causality. Parehong pwede yan eh. It could be that aggression can cause stress or stress can cause aggression. But given the fact na yung method nga natin is correlation, hindi natin alam which is which. Another example, number 2. How many % of Filipinos approve of sex before marriage? Kayang-kayang sagutin ng survey yan. Pero pag halimbawa itwist ko ng konti yung tanungin kita, does premarital sex enhance or destroy self-esteem? Or does having low self-esteem make someone open to premarital sex? Hindi na kayang sagutin ng survey yan because those two questions in red are questions of causality. Gusto nating malaman ano yung cause, gusto nating malaman ano yung effect ng cause, di ba? So again, those 5 methods that I discussed, hindi nila kaya mag-establish ng causality. But the good news is, experiments can establish causality. Ito ngayon yung isang bagay na kayang gawin ng experiment na hindi kayang gawin ng 5 methods to answer questions of causality. And again, what do you mean by questions of causality? Kapag meron kang gustong malaman na merong cause and effect relationship. Gusto mong malaman kung yung isang variable ba, which is the cause, meron ba siyang epekto doon sa isa pang variable, which is the effect. That's what you mean by questions of causality. Some examples of questions of causality are the following. Does attending church regularly make someone more positive? Nasaan yung cause dyan? Attending church. Nasaan yung effect dyan? Make someone more positive. Number 2, does aggression affect stress level? Nasaan yung cause dyan? Aggression. Nasaan yung effect dyan? Yung stress level. For number 3, nasaan yung cause dyan? What changes in self-concept happen after females experience their first menstruation? The cause is the experience of first menstruation. Ano yung effect dyan? Yung changes in self-concept. Diba? Again, you have to look for that. The cause and the effect. Kapag ganyan yung tanong mo, kapag ganyan yung structure ng tanong mo, then that means you are asking a question of causality. If your question does not have that, wala siyang A going to B, wala siyang A arrow B, then that means that is not a question of causality. And that question cannot be answered by experiment. And that is the reason why I ask you to write down 3 psychological questions kanina na sa tingin mo kayang sagutin ng experiment, di ba? So you go back to your notebook, tapos tignan mo ulit yung mga questions mo. And then I would like you to evaluate if the questions na sinulat mo dyan are questions of causality. Kasi yung instruction ko kanina, di ba? Magsulat ka ng mga tanong na kayang sagutin ng experiment. Therefore, those questions that you have written down on your notebook must be questions of causality. So, mag-decide ka ngayon, based on what you are learning so far, if the questions that you have written there are actually questions of causality. Okay? So, again, I'm going to give you time, pause the video if you need to evaluate kung yung mga tanong ba na sinulat mo sa notebook mo are questions of causality. So in summary, as we close our discussion for today, going back to my opening statement, what is so special about experiments na more powerful siya compared to the other methods? There you go. Now you know the answer. The answer is only experiments can identify the cause of certain outcomes. Yung experiment lang yung kayang gumawa niyan. They are able to establish causality. If we want in psychology to identify cause of certain effects, then most likely we are going to use experiments. Now, is that even important? Importante ba na mag-establish tayo ng causality in psychology? The answer is yes. Because kapag alam natin yung cause ng isang outcome, we will be able to, based on the slide, to predict and prevent certain outcomes. And that's what we want in psychology, di ba? Gusto nating makapag-predict, gusto natin makapag-prevent ng mga outcomes in psychology na hindi magaganda, di ba? After all, yan yung gusto ni John Watson, no? Ang psychology daw dapat nagpe-predict at nagko-control ng behavior. We would like to identify those variables out there that can predict what we will do or that can control what we will do. And the best way to identify those variables, those psychological variables, is to use experiments. Halimbawa, do you agree here? Kapag alam na natin yung cause ng depression, because we did a lot of experiments, now we know what causes depression, di ba? Ang laking tulong yan sa field of psychology. In what way? Because you already know the cause of depression, you can predict who will become depressed. So, pwede mo na kaagad-agapan or alam mo na kung sino yung bibigyan mo ng intervention or counseling, di ba? If we know the cause of depression, then that means we will be able to prevent the onset of depression. Kasi alam mo kung ano nagkakos eh. So, pwede ka na mag-imbento ng mga techniques para yung mga cause na yon hindi na mangyayari, para hindi na siya mag-lead to depression. See, that's what we will be able to do kapag nakaka-identify tayo ng mga causes. And experiments can do that. So the question now is, kailangan ba itapon na natin yung ibang mga methods? Mas powerful naman pala yung experiment eh. So wag na tayong mag-observation, wag na tayong mag-case study, wag na tayong mag-correlation. The answer is hindi ganon. Hindi naman ibig sabihin na mas powerful yung experiment over the other methods, hindi na tayo gagamit ng ibang mga methods. Because those other research methods in psychology that we use, meron pa rin silang purpose, meron pa rin silang silbi. And what is that? Those other methods, we can use that to give us an idea what to experiment about. Ibig sabihin, yung mga questions of causality natin in the first place, pwedeng manggaling yan doon sa mga research methods na pinag-usapan natin. Let me demonstrate. Halimbawa, no? Let's say I observe this. People who are crowded in a poorly ventilated place seem to express irritable and do aggressive behaviors. Naobserbahan mo yan, for example, in one government office, nagpunta ka, pumila ka, mainit, at nakita mo na yung mga tao doon, mga masusungit, mga wala sa mood. Okay, so you observe that. Diba? Gumamit ka ng observation in identifying that idea. But that observation question can be converted into a question of causality. So from there, pwede mong itanong, does high temperature cause irritable and aggressive behaviors? Nakakainit ba ng ulo yung mataas na temperatura ng kwarto? O diba, nakaisip ka ng isang question of causality because of observation. Another example, nakabasa ka ng isang case study about a teacher. Professor A believes that his extremely high intelligence in mathematics is due to his extremely high religiousness. Naniniwala siya na kaya siya magaling sa math kasi religyoso siya. So you read that from a case study. Pero yung nabasa mo na yan sa case study, pwede ka ngayon magtanong ng question of causality. It will give you an idea. Therefore, does that mean that being religious can cause high intelligence in mathematics? Ang ibig sabihin ba nun na kapag religyoso ka, gagaling ka sa math? So, yung mga mahihina sa math, ang isang paraan pala dyan para gumaling sila sa math, gawin natin silang religyoso. So, there's only one way to find out if that's the case, and that is to do an experiment. Okay, so I hope you've learned a lot of things from our lesson for today, but let me just close this class by summarizing the key points na dapat natandaan nyo in today's lesson. Number one, I hope you realize that there are many methods in answering psychological questions. Diba? So, hindi lang iisa. Experiment is one of the way to answer psychological questions, pero hindi lang experiment yung pwede nating gamitin. We also have other research methods out there that we can use to help us answer psychological questions. Number 2, experiment is a method that we use so that we can answer questions of causality. Hindi lahat ng psychological questions kayang masagot ng ibang mga methods na pinag-usapan natin. There are certain psychological questions out there that is a question of causality. We would like to know what causes a certain effect. Now, in questions like that, number 1 bet mo talaga, gagamitin mo yung experiment as a method to answer those questions. And last one, number 3, hindi nangangahulugan na hindi na natin gagamitin yung ibang research methods given the fact that experiments are more powerful than these methods. Because these research methods that we discussed can still be used para bigyan tayo ng idea on what to experiment about. So those are the most important lessons that you should have learned for today in today's lesson in our experimental psychology lab. So I hope you learned something today. Thank you for listening. Until the next lecture video, thank you and God bless.